General Hospital spoilers tease that the past never stays buried in Port Charles, especially when blood is at stake. As news spreads that Jonathan Jackson is returning to the role of Lucky Spencer, it isn't nostalgia driving the moment, it's a father's desperate mission to save his son. The crisis begins quietly, behind the doors of Elizabeth Weber's home. Her decision to take Willow in was rooted in compassion. Willow needed a place to heal, a place free from noise and pressure, and Liz offered that refuge without hesitation. But kindness doesn't come without consequences in this town. Drew Kane, increasingly unstable and desperate to exert control over his fractured world, sees Willow's presence at Liz's house as a threat. Not just to his version of order, but to the secrets he's been trying to keep under wraps. Drew storms into Liz's home without warning. His tone is calm at first, calculated. He frames his demand under the guise of concern. He questions Willow's influence, suggests she's not emotionally stable, that her proximity to the kids could be damaging. But Liz doesn't flinch. She reminds him that this is her home. That Aiden is safe. That Willow is recovering, and she has every right to peace and shelter. But Drew isn't here for discussion. When Liz refuses to kick Willow out, his demeanor shifts. Something darker flashes behind his eyes. He issues threats, not outright, but implied enough to rattle Liz's nerves. She knows he's unhinged, but she doesn't think he would ever cross a real line. That assumption shatters the next morning. Aiden doesn't show up for school. Liz calls around. No one's seen him. Panic sets in like a fast-moving fire. She races through the house, calling his name, praying it's just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she already knows. Something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong. There's a note. Handwritten. No signature. Just 5 words. You pushed too far, Elizabeth. Liz clutches it with shaking hands. Her breath disappears from her lungs. And in that moment, she realizes the one thing no mother should ever have to say aloud. Drew took her son. There's no evidence. No witnesses. No phone call to the police will bring him back in an hour. Liz knows the system, knows how easily Drew will slip through it if she can't prove anything. But she doesn't call the cops, not yet. She calls Laura. And Laura calls Lucky. When Lucky answers the phone, the years between them vanish in an instant. His voice hardens with every word. Aiden is missing. Drew is suspected. Liz is spiraling. And Lucky doesn't wait for an invitation. He's already booking the next flight back to Port Charles. His return isn't quiet. The moment Lucky walks into General Hospital, the tension shifts. Nurses stop mid-step. Doctors turn. Even Finn looks up from his chart with wide eyes. Laura rushes to embrace her son, stunned by how little time has changed him, and how much pain now darkens his eyes. Lucky doesn't pause. He doesn't wait for small talk. He wants answers. And he wants Drew. Liz breaks when she sees him. She collapses into his arms, the weight of the past and present crashing down in sobs. For a moment, there's no Aiden, no Drew, no crisis, just 2 people who once shared a life, locked in the ache of what they lost and what they might now lose again. But Lucky doesn't linger in grief. He shifts into motion. He knows Drew's patterns. He knows where he'd go if he wanted to stay hidden. Drew isn't a criminal by nature, but he's becoming one by desperation. And desperate men don't make rational choices. Lucky tracks him to an abandoned property just outside town, a cabin once owned by a patient at Shadybrook. Aiden's jacket is spotted near the woods. That's all the confirmation Lucky needs. He doesn't wait for backup. He charges into the cabin, and there he finds it. Drew. Standing between him and Aiden. The child is scared, pale, eyes darting between 2 men who once both played roles in his life. Drew isn't holding a weapon, but his posture, his defiance, is dangerous enough. He says it's not what it looks like. That he only wanted to talk to Aiden. That he wanted him to understand what was happening with Liz and Willow and why it wasn't safe. Lucky doesn't listen. He lunges. What happens next will haunt Port Charles forever. A struggle. A flash of panic. A blow to the head. When the dust settles, Drew Cain lies motionless on the floor. Aiden is safe. But the price of that safety may be more than anyone expected. Lucky calls Laura. His voice is quiet. I got him back. But he also calls the police. He doesn't run. When Liz arrives at the PCPD, she finds Lucky in handcuffs. He's calm, solemn, but there's no regret in his eyes. Only peace. He did what he had to do. For his son. Scott Baldwin, back in town and ready for a courtroom war, offers to defend Lucky. Alexis, though retired, offers advice. Laura pulls every string she has with the mayor's office. And Liz? She stays beside Lucky through every step. The town is divided. Half see Lucky as a hero. The other half fear what Port Charles is becoming, what it has already become. As the trial looms, tensions rise. But the truth begins to spread. Drew's mental state was deteriorating. His obsession with control had grown darker over the months. Several people come forward, nurses, neighbors, even Jocelyn, with stories of erratic behavior. The picture becomes clearer. It wasn't an ambush. It was self-defense. In the end, the charges are reduced. The judge rules in favor of leniency. Lucky is free. But the victory is bittersweet. Aiden, though safe, now carries the shadow of what happened. Liz and Lucky, while bonded again, carry the cost of trauma neither asked for. And Drew, though no longer in the picture, leaves behind questions that Port Charles will wrestle with for months. Lucky walks with Aiden through the park a few days later, watching the boy chase birds across the lawn. He smiles, faintly. Are you staying? Aiden asks. Lucky kneels. For as long as you want me to. And Aiden wraps his arms around his father. For the first time in years, the Spencer legacy doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like a beginning. The days following Drew's death brought a strange stillness over Port Charles, as though the town was holding its breath. For some, the silence was relief. For others, it was the start of something darker. News of Lucky Spencer's return spread fast, and so did the whispers about what happened in that cabin. While the courts chose leniency, not everyone was satisfied with justice as it stood. The damage Drew left behind didn't die with him. It scattered like glass, sharp and unavoidable, across the lives of everyone he touched. Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She tried, night after night, but her mind refused to quiet. Aiden was home, and he was safe, but his eyes were different now. He didn't talk about what happened. He didn't cry. He didn't even ask about Drew. That silence was louder than any scream. Liz sat outside his room most nights, listening to the rhythm of his breathing through the door, wondering how to reach him. The only person Aiden seemed to open up to was Lucky. Lucky moved back into town temporarily, staying in a small house near the lake. He hadn't made any long-term promises. He wasn't sure what came next. Port Charles had a way of dragging old wounds into the present, and he didn't know if he could survive being pulled under again. But every time Aiden looked at him like he was safe, like maybe the world wasn't going to fall apart after all, Lucky stayed another day. Laura was cautious. As mayor, she had to keep a certain distance from the legal side of what happened, but as a mother and grandmother, her instincts were fierce. She met with Liz often, offering quiet support, making sure Aiden had the resources he needed, ensuring therapy appointments were scheduled, and that the public backlash didn't find its way to their doorstep. Laura knew how quickly the town could turn. She had lived through enough scandals to recognize when a storm was coming. And something about the way people were talking about Drew made her uneasy. Rumors began surfacing that Drew's mental health had been quietly deteriorating for months. A former nurse from the clinic where Drew had received trauma therapy came forward anonymously, claiming that Drew had been battling intense paranoia and episodes of obsessive behavior. The nurse mentioned he had become increasingly focused on controlling the people in his life, particularly Willow and Aiden. But official records showed no diagnosis, no hospitalization, no formal intervention. Drew had been slipping, and no one had stopped him. Willow was the one hit hardest by the revelations. She blamed herself, not because she thought she was responsible for Drew's actions, but because she had seen the red flags and said nothing. She had hoped he would heal. She had wanted to believe in redemption. Now she carried the guilt of silence and the burden of being the person he tried to use as a pawn. She left Liz's house and moved into a quiet rental near the edge of town. She barely spoke to anyone except Michael, who tried to help her process the grief, even though he was also navigating the aftermath of Drew's choices. Liz visited Willow one evening, bringing groceries and a familiar face. They talked for hours. Liz shared her nightmares, her guilt, her anger. Willow finally cried. It wasn't a fix, but it was something. A moment of shared truth between two women who had both lost different versions of the same man. Meanwhile, trouble brewed in the corners of town. Carly Corinthos, never one to remain silent for long, began asking questions. Drew had been her ally for years, someone she trusted. His spiral didn't make sense to her. She started digging, pulling up timelines, questioning witnesses, reviewing security footage. What she found was troubling. There were days when Drew claimed to be one place but showed up in another. Bank records that didn't match. Calls made to numbers with no trace. Carly took her findings to Laura. Laura, in turn, reached out to Jordan Ashford, who reopened Drew's background investigation not on the kidnapping, but on his actions in the weeks leading up to it. They uncovered a second bank account, opened under a false name, connected to withdrawals in a pattern resembling payoffs. The name linked to the account raised even more eyebrows. Victor Cassadine. Though presumed dead and long buried, Victor's reach had extended far beyond his physical presence. The discovery of the account forced everyone to ask a horrifying question: was Drew manipulated into his final breakdown? And if so, by whom? Laura called a meeting at City Hall with Lucky, Elizabeth, Willow, Carly, and Jordan. The evidence suggested that Drew might not have been working alone. Someone had fed his paranoia. Someone had directed him toward Liz and Aiden. And now, with Drew dead, that trail had gone cold. But the implication was clear. There was someone else out there, someone who wanted chaos and used Drew as the weapon. Lucky was furious. Not because it cleared Drew, but because it meant the threat wasn't over. Whoever orchestrated the breakdown could try again, with someone new. He increased security around Aiden. He stayed closer to Laura. He warned Liz not to go anywhere alone. For the first time since returning to town, he felt the old instincts kick back in. Not just to protect, but to fight. Then a new clue emerged. Aiden received a package at the hospital's front desk with no return address. Inside was a drawing. A child's sketch. It was Aiden, holding hands with a man who looked like Drew. But the eyes were crossed out in red. The message was clear. Someone was still watching. Lucky tightened the circle. He called Robert Scorpio and Anna Devane. They agreed to bring WSB eyes onto the case, in secret. No press. No public statements. The danger was real, and they needed to be 2 steps ahead. In the weeks that followed, Port Charles began to shift again. Aiden slowly opened up. Therapy sessions helped him speak about the cabin, the fear, the confusion. He never said he hated Drew. He didn't even understand what had happened, not fully. But he clung to Lucky like a life raft. Elizabeth watched it all quietly, her heart breaking and mending at the same time. She saw how Lucky steadied her son. She saw how he sat on the floor with him for hours, building Lego towers, watching movies, telling stories from their old adventures. And she saw something else too, something she hadn't let herself hope for in years. Stability. Not the illusion of it. Not the fragile peace they always fought to maintain. But a chance at something new, built from fire and forgiveness. Lucky didn't talk about staying long-term. But he didn't talk about leaving either. And sometimes, that was all she needed. The final thread began to unravel late one stormy night when Robert Scorpio received a call from an encrypted WSB contact station in Prague. A data breach had occurred at one of Victor Cassadin's former safehouses, recently abandoned but still being monitored. The breach was subtle but unmistakable. Someone accessed files tied directly to Drew Kane's psychological evaluations from years prior, files that were never supposed to exist. It confirmed the worst suspicion. Drew hadn't just spiraled on his own. Someone had engineered his breakdown. Robert relayed the information to Laura and Lucky immediately. They met in the mayor's office, its windows rattling from the wind outside, the air tense with urgency. Laura sat forward in her chair, her voice low. "We always assumed Drew was acting alone. That his trauma caught up with him. But if he was being manipulated, we might be looking at the beginning of something much bigger." Lucky didn't hesitate. "We need to find out who accessed those files. And fast." Elizabeth joined them, her face pale but determined. "I need to know who did this to Aiden. If someone made Drew a weapon, then they didn't just kill him. They destroyed everything he touched." Jordan brought in Anna Devane the next morning. Anna cross-referenced the Prague data with recent WSB intelligence, finding a familiar name embedded in the code used to breach the system: Roman Trask. A former WSB operative believed to have defected during one of Victor's rogue missions. Trask had vanished after the collapse of Victor's European network, presumed dead. But now, his name was back, hidden in digital shadows and fragments of erased data. Roman had once specialized in psychological manipulation. His missions had focused on identifying vulnerable agents and corrupting their sense of reality. If Trask had gotten to Drew, it would explain everything: why he unraveled so quickly, why he isolated from his support system, and why he ultimately snapped. The search for Trask became a silent race. Laura authorized a covert task force. Lucky worked side by side with Anna, even flying briefly to Amsterdam to follow up on a lead that took them to an old Cassadine shell company. But Trask remained a ghost. Back in Port Charles, something else changed. Aiden, after weeks of silence, finally asked Liz if Drew had meant to hurt him. Elizabeth hesitated before answering. "I think Drew didn't know how to fight what was happening to him," she said. "But that doesn't mean he stopped loving you." Aiden nodded slowly, as if processing something much deeper than the words. Then he asked, "Is Dad staying this time?" Liz didn't answer. She looked toward the hallway, where Lucky stood just out of sight, listening. That night, Lucky sat with Aiden and told him a story about his own childhood, about a time he felt scared and alone, and how it taught him that running away never solved anything. Aiden didn't say much, but when Lucky rose to leave, he grabbed his father's hand. "Don't go," Aiden whispered. Lucky stayed. The decision to remain in Port Charles wasn't made with fanfare. Lucky simply declined a return assignment from the humanitarian mission he'd been part of. He sold the Amsterdam loft he'd been calling home. And quietly, without needing to ask permission, he moved into the guest room in Liz's house. It was a beginning that didn't ask for celebration, just presence. Meanwhile, the search for Roman Trask finally hit a break. A digital transaction led WSB operatives to a private estate in the Greek Isles, property long rumored to have belonged to Helena Cassadine. The house had been dormant for years, but now it was active again. Satellite imagery confirmed movement. Robert Scorpio arranged for an extraction team, but Lucky volunteered to go. "I need to see the man who destroyed my son's life," he said. "I need to look him in the eye." Anna hesitated but agreed. She knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. The operation was clean. No shootouts. No blood. Just a man found sitting alone in a library filled with unread books. Roman Trask didn't resist arrest. When asked why he did it, why Drew, why Aiden, he only said, "Because the Cassadines don't die. They echo. I was just keeping the rhythm." He was extradited to a secure WSB facility in Berlin. And just like that, the man who nearly destroyed an entire family was gone, swallowed by the same system that once trained him. Back in Port Charles, the atmosphere shifted. Willow returned to GH, not as a patient but as a volunteer counselor for families coping with trauma. Her presence brought healing to more than just the people she served, it gave her purpose again. Liz found herself leaning on Lucky more, not because she needed him to fix things, but because his quiet support made the world feel lighter. Their connection wasn't defined by romance anymore. It was deeper. Older. Something built from survival and trust. Laura spent more time with Aiden, bringing him books, helping him paint. She watched as he slowly returned to himself. There were still nightmares, still quiet spells, but there were also jokes, and music, and the way he started asking about school again. Lucky took him to the park one afternoon. Aiden kicked a soccer ball across the field and shouted for his dad to chase him. Lucky laughed a real laugh, not weighed down by guilt or memory. In that moment, something inside him finally let go. That night, he sat on the porch with Liz. The sky above them was clear, stars scattered like glitter. "Think we'll ever stop waiting for the next crisis?" Liz asked. Lucky leaned back. "No. But maybe we'll be ready for it when it comes." They sat in silence for a while, then went inside together. And for once, the doors of the Weber house closed not on chaos or tragedy, but on something closer to peace. The kind of peace that Port Charles rarely gets. But for now, they had it. And that was enough.